He didn't call it a plan, he called it a game. And tonight we begin with the truth behind the title. The game he created as a boy revealed the killer he'd become. A normal street, a quiet kitchen, a gold star on a report card, while a criminal mind sketches its first blueprint in the margins of childhood. Forensic psychology has a name for this: deviant behavior rehearsed as pretend play, the kind that blooms in traumatic childhoods and hides behind good manners. He wrote rules no one heard. He kept score no one saw. A babysitter laughed at a strange drawing. A teacher filed a note. Parents called it a phase. Those were the ignored signs. Think about your own childhood games. Would you have noticed the pattern? When a boy insists on control and calls it fair, when he smiles without blinking, when apologies sound memorized, do you feel it or excuse it? In forensic terms, we're watching a script form: repetition, rehearsal, reward. The game trains silence, then obedience, then something colder. The small victories feel harmless until the goal changes. That's where the title points us. This is the story of how play became policy, how a child's invention mapped a future no one wanted to read. Stay with me because the page that proves it exists. And before this video ends, we'll open it. The place where a boy's rules stop sounding like a game and start sounding like a warning. In the kind of town that prides itself on being ordinary, where mornings smell like toast and pencil shavings and the loudest sound after school is a bicycle chain skipping a gear, he blended in without effort. Mention the year, and it looks almost innocent on paper. A neat line in a diary that could belong to anyone. He earned gold stars for neat handwriting, returned library books early, never raised his voice, and never broke the line when the class marched down the hallway. He learned early that adults relax when a child is polite. That mask of normalcy fit like a second skin. Light, enough to forget, and strong enough to hide the bruises on the inside of a mind learning something darker. For anyone watching from a distance, this was a boy who performed childhood correctly. For forensic psychology, it is the kind of beginning that hums with quiet alarms. The kitchen table was his headquarters. There were cereal boxes, homework worksheets clipped at the corner, and a cup of dull pencils he sharpened until the tips looked surgical. He made schedules and chore lists because schedules and lists looked like good behavior. He preferred games that involved rules, tally marks, and keeping track of who did what. He called it practice, without saying the word. If you are a parent, a teacher, a neighbor, ask yourself what you would have seen: a tidy child, a careful child, or a child who needed control as much as air. Criminal psychology calls this a compensatory pattern, a strategy to create predictability when the environment feels like a storm. In public, it reads as model student. In private, the storm studies itself and starts to map the wind. The game began as an arrangement no different from chores. He named it the Rulebook. He wrote the title across the first page of a notebook with a cover that looked like it belonged in math class. He never said it out loud. He would have denied that it was a game at all. Games are for fun. This was for order. Rule 1, follow orders. Simple, harmless, even helpful. He created silly missions that sounded like play. A scavenger hunt in the backyard. A time challenge to see who could be silent the longest. A trick for keeping secrets that he disguised as a magic act. There were tiny prizes, extra turns on the console, a piece of candy saved from Halloween, a sticker. Rewards make the brain cooperate. This is something every parent learns, and a criminal mind learns it earlier and uses it longer. He practiced Rule 1 in every environment that would let him. In classrooms, he volunteered to be line leader and hall monitor, not because he wanted to help, but because leadership gave him a small laboratory for the feeling he loved most. In the neighborhood, he taught younger kids a hand signal that meant stop and a whistle pattern that meant come here. Innocent, right? Coaches call that initiative. Principals call it responsibility. The mind behind the rulebook called it calibration. Each success was a click of a dial that normalized an identity built around control. If someone refused or questioned him, he smiled and tried again later. Patient, relentless. A future offender rehearsing compliance before he ever asked for it. The family photographs insisted on the mask. He posed with a dog he barely looked at, With birthday balloons he did not want to touch because balloons burst without warning, with relatives whose hugs he timed like drills. If you study these pictures the way a forensic psychologist studies a crime scene, you notice the hands. He is always arranging something. A sleeve straightened, a candle adjusted, a ribbon repositioned to face front. The body tells on the brain. This is deviant behavior in miniature, not because it is violent, but because it elevates control over connection. He was building a private language where obedience felt like safety, and people felt like pieces on a board. Teachers wrote comments that were almost compliments. Works well independently, quiet during group time, follows instructions. A few wrote notes that did not reach the parent. Conference folder. Watch him around younger students. Interrupts when rules are explained to correct the teacher. Shows unusual interest in setting consequences. Those were the ignored signs, the ones that look like quirks until the pattern thickens. If you had been there, would you have seen them? Or would you have told yourself he was simply meticulous? Everyone prefers a neat child to a loud one. That preference is the smoke that hides the fire. The rulebook collected moments that felt trivial on their own and heavy when lined up. He liked to time people and record the results. He liked to assign points for behaviors only he identified. He liked to offer choices where both paths led to him winning. When a friend protested, he reframed it as fun. When a babysitter told him no, he waited until she was tired and tried again. Forensic psychology has a phrase for this rhythm: repetition, rehearsal, reward. The brain is a muscle that answers to practice. Child play is supposed to build empathy and creativity. In his hands, it built procedure. There was a second rule. He never wrote it. He tested it. Rule 2 was not spoken. It was planted like a tripwire across ordinary afternoons. He would ask for a small secret, nothing dangerous, and then he would check who could keep it. He would modify the rules of a board game and monitor who noticed. He would promise a reward and then delay it to measure patience. Rule 2 was simple once you see it on the page that never existed. Maintain silence. The game now had 2 pillars: obedience that felt like cooperation and silence that felt like loyalty. He learned to read faces with the focus of a surgeon, cataloging who looked away under pressure and who swallowed discomfort to keep the peace. These were the metrics that the rulebook needed. These were the numbers that taught him which people were useful and which needed to be managed more tightly. If you are watching this and thinking of a child you once knew, stay with that feeling. The purpose of this chapter is not to diagnose, but to decode what a normal childhood can conceal when a traumatic interior is writing the script. A mind that does not feel safe learns to choose certainty over care. A mind that discovers the thrill of power learns to chase it through games that adults praise without reading the fine print. This is the setup that hides in plain sight, the innocence with sharp edges, the daily life that looks fine from across the street and feels wrong up close. The title promised that the game he created as a boy revealed the killer he would become. The revelation does not arrive in a lightning strike. It arrives as a sequence of tiny storms that he learned to call clear weather. Rule 1 taught him to command. Rule 2 taught him to erase the noise. The rest of the rules are coming, and once you see them, you will not be able to unsee them. The game did not stay small. At first, it lived in safe corners of the day, tucked between homework and dinner, a private ritual that looked like ordinary play to anyone passing by. Then the rhythm changed. He began measuring things that no one else noticed. He kept score in secrets, not points. Who could keep a confidence for an hour, for a day, for a week? Who would follow an instruction without asking why? Who would accept a rule that did not quite make sense? In clinical language, this is the shift from pretend to control, from harmless experimentation to operant conditioning. A child with a frightened nervous system discovers that the world can be rearranged if you can get people to move on your count. Rewards appeared in careful doses. A sticker if you completed a task. Extra time outside if you complied quickly. The coveted seat at the end of the table if you did not complain. Tiny reinforcers, variable enough to stay interesting, predictable enough to feel safe. Punishments were smaller still, but they grew teeth. A chore you did not like, a withheld treat, a pause as he looked at you long enough to make you want to fill the silence with an apology. If you lost, you owed him silence. That rule worked like a key. It made children police themselves. It taught them to feel responsible for his mood. It taught him that guilt in others is a lever you can pull. He did not shout. He rarely argued. He made suggestions that sounded like help. We should change the way we keep time so the game is fair. You go first so we can practice waiting. Sit here so we can test something. Forensic psychology calls this incremental desensitization. The structure remains playful, while the demands replace play with obedience. When adults praise cooperation and quiet, the practice becomes invisible. The deviant behavior is not the request itself, but the purpose behind it. The data he is collecting on everyone around him. He is not playing with peers, he is calibrating subjects. A concrete red flag arrived in a living room on a rainy afternoon. He rewrote board game rules, so only he could win. He did it with a smile that asked for admiration and a logic that borrowed vocabulary from math class. The dice could be re-rolled under certain conditions. The cards could be traded if a player had shown good sportsmanship. The finish line could be extended to make the victory more rewarding for everyone. The adults heard creativity. The children felt the ground move under their feet. A few protested, then stopped when the room fell quiet, and the reward box moved closer to his side of the table. He learned that consequences land better when they feel natural. So he designed natural consequences. If you went against the new rules, you simply lost the privilege to know the next part of the game. If you persisted, you sat out and watched the fun continue without you. Exclusion is a powerful teacher. It told the group that harmony belonged to him. It told him that power could be soft and still absolute. This is the kind of rehearsal that forensic casework finds years later hidden in family memories and school notes. Micro-punishments, macro-impact. The boundaries moved a millimeter at a time until the room belonged to his timing. He field-tested his methods with siblings, cousins, neighborhood kids who were younger or shyer or just eager to be included. He learned which personalities folded at the first sign of tension and which needed a private conversation. He learned that praise can be engineered like a trap. Compliment someone for being loyal, then watch. Then perform loyalty to earn the feeling again. Praise another for being brave, then supply situations that require bravery on his terms. He would appear generous with kindness, and then make kindness a currency he controlled. In trauma psychology, this is attachment inverted into strategy. Affection becomes an instrument rather than a bond. There were moments that looked harmless, but recorded something cold. He timed how long it took for a friend to confess a harmless mistake after a strategic pause. He charted who returned to the game quickly after being excluded and who sulked for hours. He tested whether a favor given in private produced better obedience than praise given in public. These are not childish curiosities. They are the fingerprints of a mind discovering the mechanics of influence. The notebook where he tracked chores now held small tables and tally marks that could pass for math exercises. A parent flipping through would see a boy who liked numbers. A clinician would see a rehearsal schedule. The shift was not just about control over others. It was also about control over feeling. Fear shrinks when you can make other people move the way you want. Anger cools when you can decide the outcome of a room. Anxiety blurs when the script is yours. Every successful round of the rulebook trained his nervous system to seek that relief through manipulation. When relief becomes the reward, the behavior deepens. When the behavior deepens, the moral brakes wear down. Pretend gave way to procedure. Procedure became identity. He built contingencies for resistance. If someone defied him, he smiled and announced a new version of the game with a fresh name and slightly altered rules. If a parent intervened, he pivoted to adult-pleasing for a day, then resumed with softer edges. If a teacher noticed, he volunteered for a helpful role that brought him closer to authority. He was learning institutional camouflage. The criminal mind is often a slow improviser, watching systems and learning where the blind corners live. That is how a child moves from neatness to domination, without anyone writing the word domination in a single report. The escalation carried a particular cruelty wrapped in politeness. He offered younger kids the chance to be team captains, then defined captain as the one who enforces his rules. He taught a secret handshake that did not mean friendship, but compliance. He included a newcomer enthusiastically, then gave them a micro-task, designed to fail so he could practice recovery control. None of this looks like violence. All of it weakens boundaries. Over time, the group stops asking why. They anticipate. They self-correct. They replicate his language. The game stops needing explanation because it has become the normal weather. If you are listening and feeling a chill, that is the point of this chapter. Not to frighten with spectacle, but to reveal how escalation hides in daylight. The boy who never raised his voice has learned a fluent grammar of dominance. The rewards and punishments are small enough to ignore until they add up to a system. The red flags are tiny and scattered until you map them and realize they spell his name. In the next chapter, the system will test a higher voltage. The same rules, the same smile, the same notebook. The practice disguised as play is almost complete. The line between game and governance is gone, and he is ready to cross into something that will not be mistaken for childhood again. Before you continue with this content that reveals the hidden side of human behavior, you need to check out the ebook, Manipulation. Inside, you'll uncover the mechanisms behind mind control, behavioral influence, and the silent strategies used by people who manipulate their environment without being noticed. It's a true map of the mind. You'll learn how real psychological control techniques work, and how some individuals camouflage, strike, and influence others while staying invisible. You need to take this knowledge to the next level, because in the psychological game, those who don't understand become pawns. After the video ends, open the link in the description and get the ebook. The first warning lived in a rectangle of paper no bigger than a hand, written in patient teacher handwriting and clipped to a stack of weekly reports. It sounded almost kind. It asked for attention without demanding it. It suggested caution around smaller children and framed the concern as a matter of guidance rather than risk. The note traveled from classroom to office to backpack to kitchen counter. It sat beneath a coupon and above a calendar of soccer games. It was filed in a folder that promised follow-up and delivered silence. In a school where the loudest problems were the ones that interrupted lessons, a quiet child with perfect margins was never going to ring the bell. The system prefers noise it can document. The absence of noise is too easy to misread as progress. The second warning arrived as color on paper. Art class had asked for self-portraits, a familiar assignment designed to celebrate identity. His portrait used careful lines and an unsettling precision. The face looked human until you counted the features and realized something was missing. No mouth in one version, no hands in another. When a child removes the parts that speak and touch, forensic psychology does not always call it prophecy, but it always calls it interesting. The drawing was pinned to a hallway board where parents lingered and complimented shading. A student asked why the hands were behind the back, and he answered with a shrug that made adults chuckle at the mystery. The drawing migrated to a folder at the end of the term, then to a box labeled keepsakes. A warning hidden in nostalgia is a warning that has been anesthetized. The third warning belonged to a babysitter with a careful eye and the kind of memory that keeps a ledger. She told herself she might be overreacting. She wrote a remark on the kitchen notepad anyway, a few lines about a new game that required younger kids to obey silent signals, and a pattern of freezing them out when they did not. She described how he narrated consequences without raising his voice, and how the dog would not enter the room when he called it. The note waited beside a bowl of fruit. It traveled no farther than the morning trash. The family thanked her for staying late and adjusted a lamp that kept flickering. Adults called it a phase, and the phase took the compliment. A phase that learns it can hide grows legs. None of these moments carried drama thick enough to force a meeting. The teacher needed proof beyond a tone. The babysitter needed a second witness. The drawing needed a red circle and an expert to justify it. Institutions run on documentation, not intuition. Documentation requires thresholds. Thresholds are designed to prevent panic, and, in doing so, they sometimes preserve it. The blindness is not a villain in a cloak. It is a filing system, a busy schedule, an inbox that never reaches empty. It is a preference for outcomes we already know how to manage. Anger we can scold, disobedience we can punish. Quiet control we can praise because it looks like cooperation. At home, the ledger grew in invisible columns. He offered to help with chores no one wanted, then assigned others the same tasks with a new title that made obedience feel like team spirit. He asked a cousin to keep a small secret and then rewarded the silence with a prize saved from Halloween. He recounted a game to an adult in a way that made himself the brave one who solved a problem. Each detail by itself was a pebble. Together they were a path. The adults were relieved by his neatness, because neatness reads as security. The truth was colder. Neatness was his camouflage. He was studying the distance between what happened and what people were willing to write down. A counselor skimmed his file and found only calm. No detentions, no fights. Notes about working well independently and following instructions. There was a single comment about an unusual interest in enforcing rules with peers. It sat on the page like a thumbprint no one had the habit of dusting. A principal looked at the attendance sheet, saw 0 unexcused absences, and concluded the stability was real. Stability can be a mask. It can also be a tunnel through which a child moves without bumping into any walls. When a system measures success by the absence of disruption, a mind that perfects the art of undisturbing others becomes invisible. The dog knew something. Animals read tension, the way a barometer reads weather. The dog stopped sleeping at the doorway of his room. The dog paused before accepting a treat from his hand, as if it had learned a lesson humans had not. A younger neighbor knew something too. She started declining invitations to play and could not explain why in a way that satisfied adults. She said it was boring. She said she did not like games that changed halfway through. She lacked the vocabulary to describe the feeling of being looked at like a problem he had already solved. Children often lack the words for discomfort. Systems often lack the patience to translate. One afternoon, a guidance aide found a small stack of index cards tucked behind a bookshelf. On each card, a rule was written in neat print. Follow orders. Keep quiet if you lose. Earn rewards for loyalty. The cards could have been part of a classroom activity. They could have been a leftover from an exercise in cooperation. They could have been anything. The aide returned them to the shelf and told herself to ask the teacher. The day moved on. The cards remained. Parents tried. They reminded him to share. They told him to be gentle with the dog. They encouraged friendships with children who challenged him. They believed that structure and warmth would curb whatever unease they sometimes felt when the house went too quiet. They were not wrong to try. They were not wrong to hope. They were wrong only in the way hope can become a story we cling to instead of a tool we use. The story said he was getting better because the reports were clean. The tool would have said, measure the right things. This chapter is not an indictment of anyone who missed a sign. It is a map of how signs look when they are scattered like leaves across a lawn that most people walk across without looking down. A note is filed and forgotten. A drawing is admired for technique. A babysitter's observation dissolves in the sink while warm water runs over a plate. Adults called it a phase. The phase learned the schedule of supervision and the gaps between eyes. It learned which doors stayed open and which voices whispered from rooms where no one took notes. The notebook appears here for the first time. It is not dramatic. It sits beneath a binder on a desk. The cover is the color of pencil lead. Inside are calendars made of boxes that look like they belong in math class. At the top of the first page is a title that looks innocent until you add it to everything else you know. The rulebook lives here in plain lines. The game that pretended to be a test of fairness is now a plan written in a hand everyone praised for neatness. The final line on the page does not confess anything illegal. It does not have to. The confession is the arrangement, the comfort with secrecy, the confidence that the world will keep mistaking quiet for good. The notebook has been waiting for a reader who understands what silence can hide. It happened on a day that should have been forgettable, the kind that blends into the blur of routine. The backyard was strung with plastic flags for a neighborhood game. A low stakes captured the flag that promised laughs, grass stains, and a bowl of candy for the winners. He volunteered to organize the teams, a role everyone accepted because he was good at details. At first, the structure looked generous. Fair sides, simple rules, a clear boundary line. People relaxed. They always relaxed when he was in charge, because order feels like safety until it doesn't. The first signal that the air had changed came disguised as an upgrade. He announced a twist that made the game more exciting. The prize wasn't candy anymore. The prize was command. The winning team would not just celebrate, they would get to assign roles for the next round. It sounded like harmless hierarchy and tasted even better because there was applause. Children like power when it is packaged as fun. Adults like it when it is organized. He had learned this lesson well. He changed the prize, not a toy, obedience. The room breathed out without realizing it had been holding its breath. This was the moment the game stopped being a game. He began to shape the field the way a conductor shapes a score. Quiet gestures, precise timing. The first round ended swiftly because he had subtly redrawn the boundaries in a way that benefited his side. He justified the change by calling it balanced. No one argued. They were having fun. He gave commands that sounded like suggestions, and every fulfilled command softened the group's resistance to the next one. The second round took longer because he used it to test something new. He assigned a teammate the job of enforcer, a word he never said out loud but implied with tasks that required a hard face and a steady voice. The enforcer reported back who hesitated, who followed, who thrived on applause, and who wilted under silence. The scoreboard now lived behind his eyes. The pivotal incident came when a younger child violated a rule he had quietly added to the list. The child crossed a line early, a mistake anyone could make when nervous. The fair response would have been a timeout or a playful reset. He did not want fairness. He wanted certainty. He gathered the group and told the story of the mistake in a way that made the mistake seem deliberate. He announced a consequence that shifted the center of gravity. The child would sit out, yes, but more importantly, the child would agree not to talk about how the rules had changed. He framed it as keeping the game fun. He framed it as protecting the surprise. He made the group nod. If you lost, you owed him silence. No one saw the hinge click into place, but the door that separates play from governance swung shut. From that point forward, the energy of the afternoon tilted toward him the way a plant bends toward light. He calibrated his voice to be just warm enough to pass as care and just firm enough to hold the leash of the room. Younger kids followed him with the eager attention that approval buys. Older kids looked away when eye contact felt like a challenge they did not want to accept. Winning wasn't enough. Control felt like oxygen. This is where identity stops being a loose arrangement of traits and becomes a structure with load-bearing walls. The task of being good at games transformed into the job of becoming the architect of other people's choices. Forensic psychology has terms for this shift that sound sterile until you watch them happen. Moral disengagement, coercive control, instrumental empathy. He knew how to read feelings, not to share them, but to steer them. He praised when praise glued someone to his plan, and withheld it the instant it might encourage autonomy. He made generosity conditional and called it fairness. Each move taught him that authority could be cultivated without noise and maintained without mess. The more he practiced, the less he needed the exterior form of a game. The structure had migrated inside him and set down roots. His notebook waited in his room, and later that night, it received a new entry that did not look important unless you had been there. A small grid for the day, a list of names marked with initials that only he could decode. A column labeled practice, another labeled perfect. Near the bottom of the page, a line that completed the system. Rule. 3 sealed the pattern that the first 2 had made possible. No witnesses to the rules. He wrote it without words by recording only outcomes, never methods. He made sure the steps that produced obedience existed only in memory. If a parent peeked, they would see a schedule. If a teacher asked, he would show a chart of behaviors that looked like time management. The real rule lived between the lines and inside the silence of everyone who had nodded along. The incident at the backyard flags echoed, in small ways, over the following weeks. Group activities tilted toward arrangements that rewarded compliance. Laughter quieted when he decided the room needed discipline. The dog avoided the doorway when the routine of tasks turned into a drill. These fragments don't look like a turn until you connect them to that single afternoon where he converted victory into authority. That is the pivot point investigators search for in timelines and families only recognize in hindsight. Identity formation is not a thunderclap. It is the steady tightening of a braid, strand by strand, until it holds. He tested the strength of the new rule the way a locksmith tests a key against quiet locks. He rehearsed versions of the afternoon in different settings and with different stakes, never grand enough to draw an adult's attention, always precise enough to give him the data he craved. He learned that secrecy tastes sweet when you pair it with belonging. He learned that groups normalize anything if you present it as tradition. He learned that the best way to guarantee silence is to make people believe they are protecting something good, a game, a team, a friendship. The fictions were containers for the truth he would not say out loud. There is a reason this chapter feels colder than what came before. The earlier parts showed a boy trying on masks. This is the moment the mask stops being a costume and becomes a face. The prize has changed forever. The candy bowl could gather dust. The thrill now lived in watching others calibrate themselves to him, in knowing that a line spoken softly could rearrange a room. When you breathe control the way others breathe air, you do not measure morality the way others do. You measure outcomes and efficiencies and the distance between an intention and its fulfillment. The turn is complete when the group stops noticing that it is acting. They carry out his structure as if it were the weather. They enforce norms they never voted on. They look to him for permission to relax. And he, now fluent in his own system, commits to the rule that protects the machinery. No witnesses to the rules, not on paper, not in confession, only in practice, only in the smoothness of a day that ran exactly as he planned. This is where the story crosses a threshold that cannot be crossed back. You can still call it childhood from the outside because the calendar insists, but inside the architecture is adult in the worst way. It is not the size of the actions that, matters here, but their purpose. That purpose has crystallized. The next chapter does not need bigger scenes to prove the point. It needs only repetition. The pattern will harden, the signatures will appear, and the page in the notebook that looks harmless will become a legend he intends to live up to. Years pass, and the boy who measured people like variables grows into a man who arranges nights with the same steady hand he once used to line up pencils. Investigators later map those nights on whiteboards, printing timelines that reach from one end of a squad room to the other, and what looks like chaos begins to rhyme. The same three rules surface like watermarks under a lamp. First, a moment of command disguised as kindness. Second, a silencing mechanism that makes witnesses complicit in their own disappearance from the story. Third, the steady erasure of any record of how the control was achieved. The childhood rulebook did not dissolve with age. It matured into a ritual. At first glance, the crimes look like isolated storms, each with its own weather pattern and unlucky horizon. Look closer, and the pressure systems repeat. He still uses small rewards to open doors. A ride offered at the exact moment someone is stranded. An apology crafted to disarm a boundary that would have otherwise held. An errand framed as a favor so the victim tells themselves they are choosing freely. Control arrives wearing courtesy. When the victim complies, he receives the same quiet rush he felt in the backyard. That oxygen of mastery that does not require shouting or spectacle. Locations shift, but the choreography remains. He spends a few minutes calibrating the room, placing himself where the angles favor him, where the exits are predictable, where visibility narrows. That is rule 1 in an adult body, patient and precise. Then the silence begins. Phones are turned off for reasons that feel reasonable. Plans are rerouted but described as minor. Alibis are planted in conversations that sound casual. In the old days, he required children to pay a debt in quiet. Now he teaches adults to do it to themselves. The method is depressingly simple. Create an arrangement that feels temporary and safe, then ask for a favor that depends on secrecy. Then move the timeline so that breaking the secret feels like betrayal instead of rescue. Investigators later call this a signature of coercive control. Survivors, when they find words, call it a spell. Rule 2 never needed ink. It needed only repetition until it felt like fate. Years into the case, a detective notices that several scenes share an eerie cleanliness. Security feeds with suspicious gaps. Digital trails that stop politely at the door. Witnesses who remember everything up to a soft edge and then nothing at all. A neighbor recalls a door held open. A colleague recalls a ride offered with a smile. No one recalls the hinge, the moment the room surrendered. That is Rule 3 at work, the adult version of no witnesses to the rules. He does not just hide the act, he hides the lesson that produces the act. He leaves behind only results, the way a magician leaves behind applause and nothing that could teach you the trick. Forensic psychologists begin to see motif where others see coincidence. Objects positioned with fussy symmetry. A clock adjusted to a particular minute that appears again and again. The staging is not flamboyant. It is tidy, almost domestic, like a child straightening a sleeve in a family photo. He is not showing off. He is reassuring himself that the world can be arranged. That reassurance is the ritual. It is the quiet resonance between what he did in a classroom and what he does now in rooms that end up in case files. The revelation the video promised does not crash down as spectacle. It arrives as paper. During a search of an old storage space, someone finds a cardboard box labeled with a generic word that could belong to any life. Inside lies the notebook the family once mistook for a study aid. The cover is the color of pencil lead, just as it was when it first appeared beneath a binder on a child's desk. The pages are full of grids that look innocent from a distance. The closer you read, the colder it gets. There are names reduced to initials, tasks reduced to one-word codes, and in the corner, columns that have followed him like shadows. Practice. Perfect. Weeks are tiled with practice. And then, every so often, a single square is marked with a different pressure of graphite. Perfect. On the last page, the pattern stands unmasked. A schedule is drawn with the same careful hand that adults once praised. Days labeled practice stack neatly, punctuated by one labeled perfect. The handwriting has aged, but the habit has not. It is a calendar of escalation written in a private language you now understand. Practice means rehearsal for control, the small tests that look like errands and favors and harmless detours. Perfect means the full expression of the system. The moment when the game stops being a game and becomes an event that leaves behind a headline and a hole. He was not born a monster. He learned a system. This is not an absolution. It is an indictment of a method that could have been interrupted when it was still wearing school shoes. Detectives hold the notebook at the evidence table and do not need to read out loud. They trace the rhythm with fingertips the way a musician might follow a melody they cannot unhear. The same 3 rules show up
in police timelines years later because they were written here first in the soft graphite of a child's certainty. Follow orders. Keep silent if you lose. No witnesses to the rules. The language evolves. The consequences swell, but the grammar holds. This is the part of the story that turns outward, because recognition is only useful if it becomes vigilance. Systems must learn to measure the right things. Parents must learn that quiet can be camouflage as easily as it can be calm. Teachers must
learn to treat certain patterns of control not as helpful leadership, but as data that requires context and conversation. Friends and neighbors must learn that discomfort without a narrative is still a signal worth naming. None of this is a guarantee. All of this is a net. There is one more thread, and it is the reason this series does not end in despair. Somewhere along the line, one person saw Rule 3 and lived to name it. They noticed the hinge. They stepped backward before the door shut. They carried a memory that does not blur at the soft edge and were brave enough to explain how the spell was cast. Their account cracks the seal on the hardest part of the pattern, the part that usually vanishes between kindness and compliance. We will follow that thread because it teaches what practice looks like up close from the other side, and how a system can be interrupted without a headline or a siren. As you sit with this, consider what detail chilled you most. Was it the unremarkable kindness that opened the door, the silence that settled over a room like dust, the crisp columns of a calendar that turned control into homework? Tell me in the comments which moment felt invisible until you saw it mapped, and which warning you think is most likely to be dismissed in real life. Your read of the pattern is not entertainment. It is preparation. In the next episode, we follow the one person who saw the rule that was never written and decided to speak anyway. This story connects directly to what comes next, and the hinge we will examine might be the difference between a closed door and a way out. Stay with me, because the final gap in the notebook is about to fill itself in, and once you recognize that mechanism, you will carry the knowledge into every room you ever enter.